Elliot, an ambitious academic, stood before the enclosure.
He held his notepad and pen, ready to document.
Inside, Azar, a lion with unnervingly intelligent eyes, paced.
This was Elliot's project, to decode Azar's consciousness, to prove the existence of complex thought in an animal.
He believed he held the narrative, the power to tell Azar's story.
Azar, however, seemed less a subject and more a silent observer, challenging Elliot's assumptions with every measured step. Elliot saw Azar through the lens of his research, a fascinating specimen.
He saw himself as the voice, the translator of Azar's unspoken language.
He didn't yet see the arrogance in this assumption, the echo of a colonial past where one story dominated, silencing all others. Azar, meanwhile, watched Elliot with an ancient wisdom. His gaze, steady and knowing, hinted at a depth Elliot was just beginning to glimpse.
Whose story is it to tell, Azar? Elliot mused aloud one day.
He imagined Azar's roars as a complex language lost in translation. He began to see the bars of the enclosure not just as physical restraints, but as the limitations imposed by human language itself. He grappled with the works of Edward Said, recognizing the echoes of Orientalism in his own work, the way the West had historically constructed the other. Azar, of course, did not answer in words Elliot could understand. His response was in the way he moved, a silent choreography of defiance and grace. Elliot, steeped in the world of academia, started questioning the very foundations of his knowledge.
Was he truly giving Azar a voice, or was he merely perpetuating the power structures that silenced the marginalized?
He reread Foucault, the words power, knowledge echoing in his mind. He saw how narratives were controlled, how history was written by the victors. Azar, he realized, was not just a lion in a cage. He was a symbol of the silenced, the marginalized, those whose stories had been systematically erased. Elliot felt a shift within himself, a growing discomfort with his own role in this dynamic. The once solid ground of Elliot's certainty began to shift. He started noticing the way Azar looked at him, not with hostility, but with a quiet assessment, as if seeing through him. He imagined the world through Azar's eyes, the world shrinking to the confines of his enclosure, the constant presence of observation, a violation. Elliot's dreams became filled with shifting landscapes, vast savannas morphing into sterile white rooms, the roar of a lion echoing in the sterile silence of his apartment. He found himself questioning his own identity, his role in this narrative he was trying to control. The more he tried to impose his understanding on Azar, the more elusive Azar became.
He was a puzzle Elliot couldn't solve, a mirror reflecting back Elliot's own assumptions.
Elliot realized that to truly understand Azar, he needed to relinquish control, to embrace the unknown. Elliot's tidy academic world started to unravel. He found himself questioning everything, from the nature of consciousness to the limitations of language. He delved into Derrida, grappling with the concept of deconstruction, the idea that language itself is inherently unstable, always already undermining its own meaning. He began to see the limitations of his own perspective, the way his human-centric worldview had blinded him to other possibilities. He spent hours watching Azar, not with the detached observation of a scientist, but with the growing empathy of a student. His notebooks, once filled with clinical observations, now overflowed with fragmented thoughts, sketches, and half-formed ideas. He started to understand that true understanding wasn't about pinning down a definitive meaning, but about embracing the ambiguity, the multiplicity of perspectives. Elliot's arrogance began to crumble, replaced by a humbling awareness of the vastness of what he didn't know. He was no longer the expert, but a student, sitting at the feet of a silent, enigmatic teacher.
Elliot's research took a philosophical turn.
He delved into the works of Deleuze and Guattari, exploring the concept of becoming animal, the idea that identity is fluid, constantly in flux.
He began to question the very notion of human exceptionalism, the idea that human language was the sole measure of intelligence.
He spent hours in silence with Azar, no longer trying to translate, but simply trying to listen.
He began to perceive the subtle shifts in Azar's posture, the nuanced language of his tale, the quiet intelligence in his eyes.
He realized that Azar was speaking, but in a language beyond words, a language of presence and instinct.
He saw the inherent violence in trying to force Azar into the confines of human language, the way it denied Azar's own unique form of expression.
Elliot started to understand that true communication wasn't about imposing his own understanding, but about creating a space for Azar's voice to be heard on its own terms.
He saw the cage not just as a physical barrier, but as a metaphor for the limitations of human perception. I abandoned my notes, my attempts to categorize and quantify. I sat with Azar, letting the silence wash over me. I realized that true understanding wasn't about extracting information, but about building a bridge of empathy.
Elliot began to see the world through Azar's eyes. He felt the frustration of confinement, the longing for the open savanna, and the dignity that shone through despite Azar's captivity.
I started to understand that Azar's silence wasn't an absence of thought, but a form of resistance, a refusal to be defined by the limitations of human language.
He realized that Azar was already speaking, in the way he held himself, in the fire in his eyes, in the silent dignity of his presence.
My role wasn't to give him a voice, but to help others hear the voice that was already there. It was a voice that spoke of resilience, of the enduring spirit that couldn't be contained by bars or limited by language. I began to see the world with new eyes. I saw the limitations of my own perspective, the arrogance of assuming that human language was the only valid form of expression.
Elliot recognized the echoes of colonialism in the way humans had imposed their narratives on the natural world. He saw how the human need to control, to categorize, had created a false sense of separation between humans and other animals.
I realized that Azar's story wasn't mine to tell, but it was my responsibility to listen, to bear witness, and to challenge the systems that sought to silence those who couldn't speak for themselves.
He understood that true freedom wasn't just about physical liberation, but about the right to define one's own identity, to tell one's own story.
I saw the bars of the cage as a symbol of the limitations we place on ourselves, the artificial boundaries we erect between ourselves and the rest of the natural world. True liberation required a dismantling of those boundaries, a recognition of the interconnectedness of all beings. I put down my pen. I realized that Azar's story couldn't be captured in words. Not my words, anyway. True storytelling wasn't about control, but about surrender, about creating a space for other voices to be heard.
He understood that the most powerful narratives were often the ones that remained unspoken, the ones that resided in the depths of lived experience.
My role wasn't to write Azar's story, but to create the conditions for Azar to write his own. True freedom wasn't about giving someone a voice, but about recognizing the voice that was already there.
Elliot knew then that his journey was just beginning. He had a responsibility to use his voice to amplify the voices of the marginalized, to challenge the dominant narratives that silenced the other.
The ink of freedom wasn't mine to wield, but it was my duty to ensure that it flowed freely for all. I looked at Azar, no longer as a subject, but as an equal. Our eyes met, a silent exchange of understanding passing between us.
In that moment, Elliot saw a depth of wisdom, a quiet power that transcended the bars of the cage.
I realized that Azar's story wasn't mine to tell, but it was mine to honor, to respect, to protect.
Azar met Elliot's gaze, a flicker of recognition in his golden eyes. For the first time, Elliot felt seen, not as the observer, but as the observed.
I saw a reflection of myself in Azar's gaze, my own humanity mirrored back at me, stripped of pretense and assumption.
Elliot finally understood. Freedom wasn't something he could give Azar. It was something Azar already possessed.
It was the freedom to be, to exist on his own terms, to speak his own truth in his own language.
And in that moment of shared silence, a new story began to unfold, a story of empathy, respect, and the recognition of the shared dignity of all beings.